first is Pieter de Baan, who's the executive director of the Trust Fund for Victims. He has worked extensively in the domain of international development, working in both for-profit and non-for-profit sectors. Over the last 12 years, he served on long-term postings in Indonesia, Egypt, Central Africa, Vietnam, and most recently in the Western Balkans. He has done extensive historical and legal research regarding the position and real-life experiences of persons affected by war and conflict. In 1995, he established a trial monitoring program of the ICTY and monitored the actions of the ICTY with respect to fair trial, development of law, and institutional development. Having worked in research, advisory, and management capacities, Mr. de Baan has extensive experience in strategic planning and resource development, as well as program development and implementation. And we are excited to hear his insights about the work of the fund. We will also hear from Kristin Kalla, who is Senior Program Officer and oversees the programming and technical aspects or technical responses at the Trust Fund. She is one of the few Americans at the ICC and is a public health anthropologist with a background in women's reproductive health. She's worked for 25 years managing health, human rights, and development programs in conflict and post-conflict countries, primarily in Africa, but also in the Middle East, in the Balkans, and Central Asia. Before working at the ICC, she worked for UNICEF, CARE International, USAID, and the World Health Organization. A few words about the format. We'll be doing, both our presenters will be walking us through a PowerPoint presentation, and we will then open it up for questions. We have about an hour and a half total, so we'll hopefully have a fair amount of time, maybe more so than the first panel, for questions. So if you had some burning questions from the first panel that relate to the fund, please feel free to ask those at the end of our presentations. Please take it away.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for introducing us. And thank you very much also to the American Society of International Law, also on behalf of Kristin, to have us today. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, anticipating also our participation in the Assembly of State Parties meeting coming week in New York. The title of this seminar today is ICC Post Kampala. Perhaps I should further clarify the introduction that I'm a bit post-Kampala myself. I came into this position as of September, which really put me on a very fast learning curve in the first two months of my position. Even if I have taken a great interest in the issue and in the material at hand during the 90s, there was a lot of education for me to be done regarding the development of the ICC and the Trust Fund for Victims in general. And I should like to express my thanks once again to Kristin, who's been working with the Trust Fund for 3 years already, also in the capacity of acting director before I came in, and who's been a great help in getting landed safely in this position. The first couple of months of my work really has been a lot of exploration. I did also carry out a field visit to the programs that we are supporting right now under a second mandate, about which we'll be telling a little bit around that, which has given me some more confidence to talk about the Trust Fund in front of you guys, because otherwise it would be a bit difficult to talk about things which I hadn't seen myself with my own eyes. Let's get on with the presentation. This will be a shared presentation. I'll do the introductory part. I'll talk about the legal basis of the Trust Fund for Victims in as far as not fully known or understood. Talk about the programmatic framework that we have, which is enshrined obviously in their own statute, but also in subsequent legal instruments developed. Talk about the projects that we are currently undertaking in two situation countries. About the lessons that we have learned, and then Kristin will take over part of the presentation, talking about the initial findings of an extensive impact survey that we carried out over the past year, designed by Kristin and basically carried out by our partners, for whom it was a learning experience as well. And these findings might not only be interesting in terms of the perception of victims as beneficiaries of our programs, but also their perceptions of the trust fund as part of the Rome Statute system as well, and maybe useful in terms of anticipating the reparations mandate, which might be triggered by a court conviction, even already in 2011. Then we'll continue that. Is it still? Yeah. We'll continue that line of thought about reparations. How do we anticipate from our perspective not only the legal implications but also the operational challenges related to that for the Trust Fund for Victims? A couple of words about our current financial status. Much has been said about that also by those who contributed to the expert papers, and this may be useful to have a snapshot for you on how we are currently right now, and we'll finish up with some of our thoughts about the outlook for 2011 for the Trust Fund for Victims. So that's the outline. The legal basis, I am assuming it's well known, but I'll run it through you, by you once again. Indeed, the Trust Fund for Victims is unprecedented as an undertaking, and has been enshrined in Article 79.2 of the Rome Statute as an expression of the dimension of restorative justice, which has been taken up by the drafters of the Rome Statute. That is, as far as the reparations mandate of the Trust Fund is concerned. The use of other resources in situations which are not necessarily case-related has been described in Rule 98 of the Rules of Procedure and Evidence of the ICC. And that particular mandate has three prescribed dimensions. One of them is psychological rehabilitation, the other one is physical rehabilitation, and the third one is material support, which is a bit of a wider category, which might include educational support for victims. Most of the times, we'll be talking about that later also, that we are trying to have a holistic approach to providing services to victims, in which we deliver packages which integrate these three dimensions, driven by the context of where the victims are. The use of other resources has further been regulated in the regulations of the Trust Fund itself. I'm not quite sure whether I'm going to read all of them, but I think we can make available the copy of the presentation so that you can read for yourself. This is just as a reminder on how the role of the Trust Fund has been described in the different legal texts pertaining to the Trust Fund, and that goes for the next one. The third slide is going to be a bit difficult, I think, for you to read from a distance, so let me just highlight some of the issues. Here again you will see the two main mandates, the reparations purpose and the other resources purpose. Reparations purpose linked to a particular case, and to be clear again, not yet triggered by any court decision yet. So the work that we are doing so far has been concentrating on the other resources, the more general assistance purpose of the Trust Fund for Victims. Again, looking at the three categories of assistance that we and our partners may be providing. One thing which I would like to highlight is that on top of these three categories, we are maintaining a number of cross-cutting approaches. Mainstreaming gender, which has been already noted from various sides, and in the paper that was written by Ms. Oosterveld already for the reader of today, is and has been and will continue to be a very important element of the work that we're doing, in view of the fact that women and young girls are amongst the most vulnerable victims in all of the situations that we are working in right now. Integrating and rehabilitating child soldiers, again, is something which is cross-cutting through these areas of intervention, including the support, not just working with the children, but also with their parents and their families and the wider community to address their needs. Promoting community reconciliation, again, is cross-cutting. And finally, addressing issues of victims' stigma, discrimination, and/or trauma. And there are various sides to that, and we hope to tell you a little bit more about that later in the presentation. Now, one of the questions which was asked to me when I was stepping into this position, and some others are also asking, what is exactly the added value or the value of the Trust Fund for Victims beyond the fact that it exists and it's sui generis and it's unprecedented? What exactly does it deliver in terms of value. Obviously, it does represent an unprecedented value of international restorative justice, which is enshrined in the Rome Statute. As a starting point, that's already quite special, but then again, the question may persist in more towards the more practical elements of our work. We do see that the Trust Fund's ability to reach out to victims who are not included in the judiciary process of the ICC does provide additional value of the Trust Fund as part of the Rome Statute system, and as such is also being appreciated. The fact that we can be responsive to specific needs of victims in ICC situations without the need to wait for the completion of judicial processes, which may take a long time, is also perceived to be a specific value of the Trust Fund for Victims as being part of the Rome Statute system. We ensure a context-driven, holistic approach, which you just referenced already, to engage with victims, their families, and their communities. Also ensuring that our engagement with victims doesn't add further stigma to them because they're being singled out. That's an important observation and a lesson that we have learned in the work that we've been doing so far. We have acquired field-based knowledge that may help inform on the scope and form of reparations, and Kristin will be addressing that later on in her presentation. And we do find that we have the ability to highlight and raise awareness of certain types of victims who are not always on, let's say, the radar screen of other stakeholders, the more traditional humanitarian or development agencies and funding partners, or even the national authorities, so that in doing so we might provide, if I may use the term, investment opportunities for them, which weren't there before, and in this way also we may address the needs of victims over and beyond the limited means that we have ourselves. You may have some questions afterwards about these things, but we just wanted to highlight them right now. Let me tell you a little bit about the projects that we have running right now. We are working in two situations. One is in northern Uganda, and the other one is in DRC. We have together 29 active projects running in these two areas. We have operational presence in Kampala and in Bunia, Eastern Congo, with staff on the ground, both international and national. And obviously we are also working with local partners. At this moment we have over 60,000 what we call direct beneficiaries, victims, and 182,000 indirect beneficiaries, which are victims and their families in both situations combined. And I think that's not bad for an organization which is operational only for 2 years now, 2 or maximum 3 years. These are the numbers more broken down by country, by situations. The next slide gives you another breakdown of categories of victims, and to highlight that direct beneficiaries are those individuals to whom the Trust Fund's immediate assistance is being provided. Indirect beneficiaries may include their families and community members who also benefit from the direct recipients' rehabilitation. And they may include the family of a father who's been receiving an artificial limb and can return to work in his fields, or the children of a mother who's been provided safe shelter and medical care after being displaced. So these are, once we have distributed the presentation, you may look into more detail what the numbers are and what the categories are. A special, as I mentioned already before, a special area of attention for the Trust Fund has been the victims of sexual and gender-based violence and abducted children. This slide gives you a breakdown by gender of these crimes, and obviously for the SGBV victims, the biggest number are female, but there are also male persons who are being victimized here as part of a systemic tactic of war, and you will see a different representation for the formerly abducted children and youth. As said, given the limited capacity of the Trust Fund itself, we are about 6 to 9, depending on how many people are actually put in positions, persons ourselves, including staff in the field. Our main way of working is working through intermediaries, and maybe also responding to a remark made earlier this morning. Actually, the term intermediary is only defined in the legal texts of the ICC as referring to the intermediaries before that are defined for the trust fund for victims and the regulations of the victims. There's a large discussion going on how other parts of the court should engage with intermediaries, but these are a much more limited, much more circumscribed group of actors. Our definition of an intermediary, for instance, also includes international organizations and international NGOs. We now have going to the next one already. We have 8 international partners, 12 local partners, and 16 local sub-grantees. One word perhaps about the way that we agree on working with intermediaries. For some of them, indeed, the work with the trust fund can be quite sensitive because they have security concerns to be associated with the trust fund, or the ICC is not always an obvious proposition in the situations where we work. And also the fact that some of our international partners have operations in Darfur makes them a bit hesitant to be associated openly with the trust fund. So to the extent they express the wish to not be mentioned publicly, we do comply with their request in this regard. A word before going on into the lessons learned and challenges. The way the trust fund works is on the basis of a needs assessment in a certain situation, which we carry out ourselves. We prepare a filing with the pretrial chamber, who is then to determine whether or not the proposed activities of the trust fund are in any way prejudicial to the other, to the activities of the other organs of the court, which obviously is very important. So even if we have a fairly large measure of independence there, still whatever we propose to do needs to be sanctioned by indeed a form of null objection by the pretrial chamber, which is indeed been obtained already for Uganda and DRC, and another filing has been done already for the Central African Republic. We'll be talking about that later. This is the format of an abbreviated format of how such a filing looks like, and how it's going to be, how it's being reviewed by the pretrial chamber. Now, without any idea of being exhaustive, these are some of the lessons learned and challenges of the work of the Trust Fund under its general assistance mandate over the past 3 years, and I'll highlight some of them. Engaging with victims and their communities through intermediaries is a very complex affair, especially when you are linked to a court where there may be, on behalf of victims, sentiments of reticence, because they don't necessarily, and it depends very much on the situation, want to be openly associated with the court, and even if they are in need of the assistance. And also where there may be a conflict of interest with the intermediaries, if that's something like I just mentioned. Their reputational or security needs need to be respected by us as well. But it can lead to very complex relationships and a large measure of caution for the trust fund to be transparent about the relationships that we have with intermediaries. Again, as said, as in the example of Darfur, other ICC situations may have an impact, and sometimes a negative impact, on the way that we are able to undertake scope and be operational in our activities. Security constraints in the field, some of the situations where we are working still are being plagued by conflict, violent conflict, makes it very difficult to brand the support that we're giving as Trust Fund for Victims support, and to disclose our partners' names. The targeting of victims, that's a question which is coming to us very much, many times. How do you do that? The targeting of victims within the jurisdiction of the ICC, apart from its definitional problems, also sometimes conflicts with the imperative of doing no harm. Singling out the victims as recipients of assistance by the trust funds in itself may cause them to be further stigmatized within their communities, because they are receiving assistance that other parties which may consider themselves as equally needy don't receive, and as such they may be object of further stigmatization. There is a need, now we're talking about the challenges, there's a need for more capacity at local level to deliver trauma-based counseling linked to reconciliation efforts for victims in affected communities. The type of work, the type of services that we're providing often requires a fairly high level of expertise, which isn't always obviously available within the situation countries where we are working. So that's really an area of attention, and that's why we are working also with international organizations in partnership with local organizations to ensure that that kind of expertise is going to be provided, and that the capacity developed will persist beyond the boundaries of any program interventions by the Trust Fund. There's a need for an increasing support for victims' physical rehabilitation, especially for specialized medical and surgical care. Some of the programs that we have been supporting in northern Uganda, plastic surgery for victims who have been victims of facial mutilations, they are proving to be, actually the Trust Fund is the only organization at this moment supporting these kind of work, together with counseling and together with economic livelihood development activities. And we do see the need for increasing investment in those kind of activities, not just in northern Uganda, but also in DRC and other situations. The need to transform what you could call an iterative approach to programming. We've been finding our way as a new institution as we went along into a more transparent and competitive grant-making approach, which we'll be piloting in the next situation that we're going to address the Central African Republic, so that indeed we can be more confident in presenting that whatever we are undertaking has been coming about in a transparent way, is providing value for money. The computer's talking back to us. Is providing value for money, quality, and a certain measure of coherence amongst the different projects that we are funding. And obviously we need to prepare for the triggering of the Trust Fund reparations mandate, which will be triggered by a court decision and subsequently by the board of the directors of the Trust Fund deciding on the engagement of resources for that particular decision, if indeed the accused is indigent or doesn't have sufficient resources to pay for the reparations foreseen by the court's decision. Next to the legal dimensions, which are very interesting, obviously, for the Trust Fund we are facing a number of huge operational challenges, not only in terms of the limited means that we have at our disposal right now, but also how to do it in such a way that reparations do serve their purpose, not from the perspective of principles only, but how to actually, in each and every situation, in each and every community where we engage, do we engage in reparations in the sense that it's being perceived to be the appropriate type of reparations by the communities and by the victims themselves. That's a challenge which really needs a fair measure of consultation with victims and the communities and other parties as well, including the national authorities in the situations where we'll be engaging in there. The issue of complementarity may take a different dimension again. And obviously there is going to be an interplay between the general assistance mandate and the reparations mandate, which we may be anticipating, but it's very difficult to predict in detail how that will work. With this, I would like to have Kristin continue with this presentation specifically about the results and initial findings of the research that we've been doing over the past year.
Oh, thank you, Pieter. Good afternoon. In early 2010, the Trust Fund Secretariat initiated a longitudinal evaluation with victims to better understand the impact of its assistance throughout northern Uganda and the DRC. The Trust Fund has an established network of over 30 national and international implementing partners, and I'd like to recognize that we actually have one partner here, the Center for Victims of Torture, so we're very happy to have you here, with whom it collected data from approximately 2,600 victims benefiting from assistance under the Trust Fund's second mandate for providing rehabilitation assistance. The interaction between the Trust Fund's two mandates, its relationship to the ICC, and its broader role within the Rome Statute system have been discussed in legal and transitional justice fields, but until now, there has been no operational research related to these issues. This study provides baseline information, and our plan is to carry out the survey every 2 years to assess change over time. We are still carrying out the analysis of this research, and a full report will be made available next year. However, I'm happy to present some of the key findings to you today. Initial findings from our research supports an approach to victims' rehabilitation and reparation that is meaningful, addressing the harm suffered, gender-sensitive and inclusive, and appropriate to the social relations and the sources of conflict with which people have experienced mass violence. As a cross-sectional study, the research captured the views, attitudes, and experiences of victims of war crimes and crimes against humanity in both situations. The study utilized a random survey representative of the total population of victims of specific crimes currently benefiting from trust fund assistance. We also used in-depth interviews, both individual and group, and consultation with stakeholders as secondary sources. And we measured impact across 6 cross-cutting impact areas. One would be justice, to assess victims' experiences with and perceptions of the ICC and Trust Fund for Victims, their knowledge of their rights, empowerment, perceptions of local conflict, and attitudes toward key concepts like justice, reparation, peace, and rights. We assessed gender mainstreaming, and we looked at victims' experience of gender justice, attitudes toward sexual and gender-based violence, and knowledge of their rights. We assessed the physical and mental health and well-being of victims, looking at their physical health and attitudes toward forgiveness and reconciliation, and how there was an interplay between the two, and how that related to their own cognitive functioning. We also assessed economic security, food security, and shelter. And finally, we measured social support and reintegration of victims with their families and communities. The survey was also offered to partners as both a monitoring tool and a capacity building exercise. Many of the Trust Fund's current partners are grassroots NGOs, and many of them are women's grassroots NGOs, in fact, in the case of Democratic Republic of Congo, with limited experience and capacity in research methods, monitoring and evaluation, or data management. Therefore, the Trust Fund staff help partners improve and build these skills as part of the survey. And so we've documented that experience as well. The sample was drawn randomly from our beneficiary population, as I mentioned, out of 15,000 beneficiaries. And of those, we targeted victims of specific crimes, but under these categories: children and youth impacted by violence, victims of sexual and gender-based violence, victims of mutilation or physical and or psychological torture, victims of pillage and or attacks directed upon a civilian population, and family members of victims, including those widowed by war and those caring for orphans, which are often the elderly. And again, this is just the breakdown in terms of the demographic information. The DRC sample is significantly younger, and so it does differ when we're looking at comparative analysis between the situation of Uganda and the DRC. And we have more women and girls in the sample because the Trust Fund focuses mainly on support for victims of sexual and gender-based violence in that setting, and former child soldiers and abducted children, many of which are girls. Both samples included significantly more widowed and divorce-separated female respondents. And this explains the overall patterns of higher rates of self-reported social exclusion for female respondents in the sample, which is often the result of conflict settings. And so you'll see more about the impact of these women psychologically later in this presentation. Some summary findings clearly show that there was a gender dimension related to the impact of violence, meaning violence impacts men and boys differently than it impacts women and girls. The findings suggested that among the Trust Fund beneficiaries, female victims had experienced more severe psychological and social consequences of violence. This in turn might relate to how women approach issues of rehabilitation, reparation, and reconciliation. The results also suggested that the very real and urgent needs that victims live with day to day, and the violence that they have experienced and the consequences of this violence all influence victims' opinions about their rehabilitation, reparation, and justice, and sometimes in different ways. Some of the research explored the psychological and social impacts of violence on the trust fund beneficiaries, and for all questions except one, women reported experiencing more severe psychological symptoms and more negative relations vis-a-vis their families and communities. And results also suggested that there is a relationship between the trust fund recognition and ICC recognition. For example, there was evidence that for victims who recognized that they were receiving trust fund assistance, they also viewed this as a form of ICC recognition. This in turn correlated with the way they viewed the ICC and its role in their communities for ending impunity. However, such a correlation depended largely on the manner in which the ICC, trust fund, and implementing partners communicated with victims and affected communities about the assistance they were receiving. I just want to provide you with some key highlights of these findings, and as stated, our research explored the psychological and social impacts of violence. And women and girls were twice as likely to report that their family was not caring at all. And almost half of the female respondents said that they were never lent or given something that they needed from their families, which indicates support from families and communities. Twice as many women as men reported feeling sad a lot of the time, and just under twice as many reported feeling lonely a lot of the time. A third of women and girls said they felt distant or cut off from others a lot of the time, compared to a fifth of men and boys. Almost 10% of female respondents said they did not trust their communities at all, and just as many said they did not feel important in their communities at all. In all measures of social well-being, women and girls reported experiencing more severe symptoms, bad feelings, and bad treatment. In particular, girls forced into sexual slavery in an armed group, the majority of whom gave birth while in captivity, reported significantly worse social stigma. Only 11% of these girls reported that their family was caring a lot of the time, versus 45% and 51% of former child soldiers and vulnerable children in general, and compared to 26% of all victims of sexual and gender-based violence. Child mothers and victims of SGBV also reported poor treatment from the community, poor treatment at school if they were going to school, and poor treatment of their child if they gave birth to that child due to sexual violence. Overall, stigma and insults ranked as the top two kinds of poor treatment reported by female victims of sexual violence and child mothers. These victims who reported poor treatment from the community said they felt stigmatized almost half of the time, and child mothers reported over half of the time that their children were consistently insulted by their communities. The majority of male former child soldiers in the DRC reported not feeling stigmatized by the community. In northern Uganda, 40% of male child soldiers or abducted youth reported never being treated poorly by their community. However, female former child soldiers and abductees who gave birth during the conflict reported significantly higher rates of social stigma and poor treatment from the community, almost twice as much as the people in the sample overall. So this is a particularly vulnerable group when it comes to restorative justice initiatives. Victims' experiences and the consequences of violence can translate into different attitudes toward concepts of justice, reconciliation, and accountability. When asked if these victims felt they had received justice, over 2/3 of child mothers, 70%, said no, versus 21% of former child soldiers and 17% of children made vulnerable to war. Over half of the victims of sexual and gender-based violence in our sample also reported feeling that they had not yet received justice. The notion of justice reflected the varied and multidimensional views of victims and their circumstances that exist in contexts of mass crimes. When the Trust Fund asked victims to describe their understandings of justice, reconciliation featured prominently. Respondents in both countries used terms related to reconciliation over terms related to trials or compensation. When asked what needs to happen to be able to forgive, rehabilitation was the most common answer in the DRC, followed by trial and punishment and compensation. And in northern Uganda, where the victim sample is much broader, rehabilitation, trial and punishment, and compensation also featured prominently. So there was a similarity between the two situations. I want to just mention that our study, we've been able to correlate this with other studies that have gone on to ensure that it wasn't just our assistance that was somehow skewing the analysis. And Berkeley also did a study in 2007 and came up with similar findings. So we were able to extrapolate that and compare that to the Berkeley study as well. We asked victims whether reparations should be given to individuals, to communities, or to both. And overall, again, our results reflected those of the Human Rights Center at Berkeley. Victims in Uganda tended to favor individually targeted reparations, while victims in the DRC favored a more collective approach. We believe these findings may also relate to how men and women approach the issue of rehabilitation and reparations differently. Women were, on average, more likely than men to say they preferred reparations to be given to individuals rather than to communities. However, we believe this has more to do with the feelings women have toward their communities and their social exclusion than it does with the particular legal debate over individual versus collective reparation. In the DRC, victims indicated an overall preference for reparations that combines individual and collective approaches, whereas in northern Uganda, victims indicated more of a preference for individual. The results reflected other findings. Victims expressed a preference for individual reparations above all else in northern Uganda, whereas victims expressed an overall preference for integrated approaches, both collective and individual, in the DRC. And we believe that this also has to do with the state of whether they are in conflict or in post-conflict settings, and the fact that there is more security in the case of Uganda, and victims themselves have returned back to their communities and have gone through a longer period of rehabilitation. For the most part, reparation programs have not been designed to consider the special circumstances of women, and as a result, legal frameworks, including policies governing national reparation programs, have lacked gender analyses and have yet to address in a meaningful way the suffering of women and girls who have been victims of violence. We found that the female victims of sexual violence in the DRC who were displaced from their communities expressed a significantly stronger preference for individual versus collective. And again, this speaks to the findings that I've already mentioned. And therefore, the operational experience of the trust fund shows that reparation programs should always take into account the social context in which victims live. And finally, the social and psychological impact of both rehabilitation assistance and reparations will depend largely on the manner in which the ICC, trust fund, and intermediaries communicate, as I've said. However, the need for communication must also be balanced by the security needs of victims and implementing partners, especially when reparations are delivered within the context of ongoing conflict, such as in the DRC. The trust fund measured whether our project beneficiaries were aware of where their assistance was coming from and what that association might be to the International Criminal Court. The results provided empirical evidence that knowing that the assistance is coming from the ICC correlated with victims' attitudes toward justice and the positive role the ICC plays, which means that those victims who knew that their assistance was coming from the trust fund as it relates to the court, they stated that they were twice as likely to name the ICC when asked in an open-ended question, who is primarily responsible for resolving conflict in your community? And we found this to actually be quite telling. And for us to be able to measure that over time, especially in the context of DRC, where you have ongoing investigations and trials and possible convictions, this will be actually quite interesting for us to monitor over time. At the foundation of our rehabilitation assistance, we we want to make sure that this assistance is helping to inform the preparations for reparations, and Pieter will be talking about that shortly in terms of how we are preparing. And so certainly we view this type of social science methodology and longitudinal evaluation with our projects, at least if we are able to share the issues with the court. So this could help to inform whatever implementation strategies we have for reparations, and also the principles that have yet to be developed. And so, again, as we release this full report next year, we hope that it'll have much more detail in terms of sharing some of these findings. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kristin. Actually, you have been the first audience to which the initial findings of this impact survey has been presented, and we do look forward to any observations or remarks that you may have, because that's going to be very much informative for us also in preparing for the next audience, which is going to be Assembly of State Parties next week in New York. Thank you very much, Kristin. I myself, I must admit, I was very, very happy coming into this particular position to find out that this survey was being carried out, because it's not something which is easily overlooked in many of the activities undertaken and whatever kind of assistance is being provided. Not just talking about the concrete results from a technical perspective of a project, but also talking about how things are being perceived and experienced by the beneficiaries, which is, in the case of victims of the crimes on the jurisdiction of the ICC, especially important. I don't know what's happening. I should take away.
It's BlackBerry.
Right, to go into the next 3 slides about how we at the Trust Fund see the operational considerations and challenges ahead when thinking about reparations, again, without any prejudice of the trial chamber's decision on how reparations will look like. We are, of course, obviously already anticipating those decisions. There have been informal consultations within the court between the Trust Fund, the VPRS and the trial chambers in this regard, and that's just at the beginning of I think of a process which will really be necessary to precede any outcome in the form of a decision by a trial chamber, if indeed it should be coming, because that's very difficult to predict as well at this particular moment. One of the first things, obviously, is managing expectations, and the question of how accessible the court is for victims and potential claimants of reparations, especially if you consider countries' difficult situations like you would have in Eastern Congo or in Central African Republic, where having access by victims and their communities to the court's processes and procedures may be a challenge in itself. On the other hand, the expectations in terms of the resources which may be available for reparations need to be managed very carefully as well, because at this particular moment, with the exception of one, all of the persons being accused are declared indigent, and the resources available at the Trust Fund for reparations are very much dependent on the voluntary contributions by states parties and other parties, and at this moment are at not a very high level, let me put it like that. The next challenge is indeed how to define a victim for the purpose of reparations. It's not the Trust Fund who's going to decide on that, but of course we will be very much dependent on the outcome of that deliberation by the trial chambers on how indeed the operation on the mechanics of reparations will look like. What is the most appropriate type of reparation is a question which I think indeed part of the research that we've been carried out, even if not always directly related to the case at hand, some of these observations may indeed be very useful to be considered by the trial chambers in terms of defining what the most appropriate type of reparations is, and also there is a need of a consultative process with the victims and the communities to be able to find the most appropriate form. There is a risk indeed that the court's victims application process limits the reach of and the participation of the reparations process, and in principle can be seen to favor individual over collective reparations, and which in turn may create even more conflict in communities than originally even foreseen. Given the nature of mass crimes of political violence in a resource-poor setting, one could argue, and this is what we are doing up front without considering the benefits of each case, that it would be useful to consider integrating collective forms of reparations with individual rewards, if only to offset some of the negative fallout of individual reparations in terms of further stigmatization of particular recipients. And also to, if you would take a particular case, in the Lubanga case where child soldiers are to be found amongst being the victims, they themselves are perpetrators themselves as well, and being perceived as such, so that needs to be taken into account in any reparations award. In terms of challenges, we do need to further intensify the collaboration and sharing of information between the Trust Fund for Victims and the registry, which is a process which has been rekindled in the past couple of weeks to good measure. Obviously, there's a long way to go in really pursuing that, but we're quite happy to report, indeed, that there is an open dialogue on the process of reparations, which does involve the registry, VPRS and other parts, and the Trust Fund in different stages, but each needs to be engaged in each stage in order to avoid any misunderstandings along the road. A cost analysis for implementing court order reparations needs to be done, preferably through a consultative process prior to decision within the court again. And then a question that needs to be answered also is how long, what is the horizon of reparations? How long should they go on? What is indeed the horizon of the intervention of the Trust Fund? Where do we link up with national processes, if there are any, or where do we instigate, are proving the incentive for national process of reparations to be started up, especially for rehabilitations? These are open questions which will need to be answered. We don't have the answer right now, but we are very much aware that these are questions that will need to be answered. And related to that, the importance of sustainability plan and exit strategies, which has implications for the ICC field operations and budget. This is going to be part of our message also next week to the Assembly of State Parties, but also a consideration for a larger public. That is, that the ICC and the Trust Fund are constrained by, even if we have a fairly large budget on first sight, many things needs to be done from that, and the Trust Fund is yet to find its way in its first mandate. And similarly, we are constrained by the present budget that we have in terms of our operational expenses and in terms of the resources that are available from voluntary contributions for programming. Final page on reparations. Dialogue and consultation. The inclusion of victims in decision-making and design of reparations needs really to be considered by the trial chamber. That's a position that we have been taking up. Gender-sensitive approaches, I think the messaging from Kristin's presentation is very clear that the gender dimension in reparations really is something that needs to be considered from the beginning, and if not, you risk to overlook the most vulnerable and also the most silent part of the victims' population that you are trying to address. And obviously the approaches need to be culturally appropriate and locally relevant, and what are the roles for local and traditional structures, not only in designing but also in communicating about reparations up front. And that's a clear challenge that needs to be taken up by the Trust Fund together, as is said in the second point, with PIDS, the Public Outreach Department of the ICC. And finally, how to ensure security and confidentiality of recipients and of intermediaries while branding, administering court order reparations. If we look at the experience that we have already, that some of our intermediaries have been very, very careful in being associated with the Trust Fund and the International Criminal Court in a relatively neutral setting as our second mandate. Once they should be involved in reparations, which is fair and square, situated within the court's procedures, their hesitation to be implicated as partners in these activities may be even much bigger, and that's something really to be considered, because there's not that many parties around which are able actually to be a partner for the trust fund in these kind of activities. Now, let me just briefly, before finishing this rather long presentation already, address an issue which may be of interest to you. That's the financial situation of the trust fund. This overview probably is very difficult for you to read. This gives an overview of the voluntary contributions by states parties over, let's say, in the existence of the since the inception of activities of the trust fund. Let me just highlight the top 5 of countries, which are Germany, Finland, Belgium, Denmark, and Norway, with France running a close 6. One of the things which I basically what my conclusion was that, again, there has been a very continuous engagement by what you could call the usual suspects in this kind of assistance to the voluntary to the trust fund. What our ambition would be, indeed, to have a larger diversity, reflecting the broad base of support of the ICC, of states parties supporting the trust fund, and next to that also looking into options of seeing non-state partners, looking at foundations and other organizations which are more in the private sector to engage with the trust fund, which again will really require a dedicated fundraising strategy, for which we don't have the resources at this moment. They haven't been foreseen in 2011, so we need to be very creative for that. And if anybody of you has a very good idea about that, we'll be most interested to hear about it. The other part of the financial overview, next one, is the pledges being made. This is the post-Kampala situation right now, during the Kampala conference. This is an overview. Some of the question marks have been filled in already as we speak. Poland has come across with some financing. Germany has announced that it will completely fulfill its pledge. Some others we're still wondering a little bit, and we're pursuing these people. But this gives an overview. One might conclude, and it has been done by other parties also, that while the pledges have been very welcome, they haven't been as voluminous as one would have expected, and that's something for us also to find out how we can really, in difficult economic times, work on that. And there'll be a natural ceiling there, but I think we haven't reached that ceiling yet. Finally, a couple of numbers. What we have totally available right now is 3.5 million, but out of that we have obligated already 1.5 million euros. I'm sorry, these are euros. To our second mandate general assistance project running into 2011. We have made a reservation for projects in the Central African Republic of 600,000, and we have made a preliminary reservation for reparations of 750,000. These euros, these figures do give, I think, a very clear indication on what the limits are of the resources. Like this is not just for one decision, one case reparations. This is the total volume of available resources for reparations at this particular moment for all cases. And we will be working to increase that, but at this moment it gives a clear indication of what the possibilities are financially, apart from legally and operationally, to engage in reparations by the trust fund. Now, briefly, for the outlook of 2011, yes, we need to increase the visibility and the transparency of trust fund-sponsored activities. I believe we have touched upon that already. I also believe that the type of research that Kristin has been doing and that will be presenting does help to increase the visibility of what we're doing, at least help explain where the trust fund assistance resonates with within the situations that we are working in. We need an operational and legal strategy for reparations, which isn't fully of our own doing. We need to consult with the registry and with the 12 chambers, obviously, about that. And we are engaging with expert institutes and organizations who may help inform us on different aspects, legal, operational, on how to go about that. We need to strengthen our grants monitoring, evaluation, and reporting systems. And I think we're doing that already as we are speaking, but that's really on our radar screen for next year also. We need to look, after 3 years of operations, what the horizon of our interventions will be, not just entry strategies, but also exit and downscaling strategies. And that's going to be part of a full program review in the first quarter of next year. we're going to release the Central African Republic tender call for proposals, and we're going to do our first needs assessment for the Kenyan situation next year as well. And then finally, about fundraising or managing your resource base, we'd like to work with key partners to improve the predictability of funding. Next to the volume, the predictability is very important for us, not just to be able to look beyond the horizon of 1 year. If you are doing serious programming, working with victims, you would like to have a horizon which is beyond the 1 year or the half year. Otherwise, you may end up doing a lot of harm more than being useful. And secondly, and that was interesting also to note in some of the presentations this morning, and some of the consultations I've been having in Kampala and Kinshasa during my site visit with the local key stakeholders. If we work with partners, it doesn't necessarily mean that the money that they are putting up has to go through the trust fund. If we can work to create operational synergies where the channeling of funding to our beneficiary target groups can go through our partners, but are serving a similar purpose or are serving to transition our type of assistance to a more development type of assistance, or embed the trust, the victims' target group in a wider group of beneficiaries, that will be very helpful as well, and we would be very happy to do that. That will require, from our side, I think, a proactive approach, and we are going to do that. It needs to be met by a response by the other partners who are not necessarily well informed, coming from a development approach, about the particularities of working with victims as a specific target group. So a lot of mutual learning needs to be done there. And I think now, with the 3 years of existence and operations that we have something to talk about. And I've noticed indeed in the conversations I had in Kinshasa and Kampala that people are listening perhaps more than a couple of years ago to the messages that we're having and are willing to consider that. So in the United States also, foundations or even USAID doesn't have to go through the trust fund as long as we can work in wider programs which ultimately are to the benefit of our target group as well. That will be most welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that excellent and very detailed overview of the trust fund activities. I think we all learned a lot. I think we have a little under half an hour for discussion, and I'd like to kick it off but then turn it over very quickly to the audience. And I want to just piggyback on the sort of last concept you left us with, which is, and Valerie alluded to this in her recommendations, that one way the U.S. in particular could help is to structure its international development programs to complement the programs of the TFV. And what that raises, I think, is a question about how the TFV programs are different from development programs. Is there a difference? Should there be a difference? And what are your specific recommendations regarding how U.S. development, international development assistance, could be designed, again, in order to support and or complement the TFV's programs?
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Actually, we've been having several consultations with the U.S. government, I would say, in the last year. And Ambassador Rapp also attended our board meeting of this new board, the first board meeting in March of this year in New York. But it's still a conversation. We were asked to provide a concept note, for example, to discuss ways about how the U.S. government could engage with our mandate. And in fact, because I used to work with USAID, I had some ideas on how best to mobilize resources and how to provide matching resources to scale up our projects and also provide technical assistance to our partners. And a lot of that conversation also has to happen at the bilateral level in terms of the missions in the countries where we're working. And so we really, are looking for other ideas on how best to try to advocate for these kinds of positions, and really happy to hear that you've placed this in the documentation in your report. But it hasn't moved past sort of the office in terms of, the concept note and proposal with how we could engage with the U.S. government at a variety of levels. So we really would encourage hearing from all of you on how we could really move this forward now from an idea to making it more operational.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let me open it up.
Just,
Please.
answer also your question about how to differentiate between the assistance of the trust fund and regular donors. Obviously, I think it's obvious, we're not a humanitarian agency by ourselves, we're not an NGO, we're not a development agency. In as far as we have a unique approach towards looking to assist victims who are within the jurisdiction of the ICC, I would like to avoid also that we are so special that nobody is able to connect with us. I mean, we are indeed working in situations where often there is poverty and being a victim or the crimes that have been committed have a relationship with that particular poverty or have a relationship between difficult relationships between groups in certain situations. So we don't want to see ourselves completely separate from that. To the extent we are able to highlight some of the needs of victims that we have encountered in our program, for example, also the needs that I just spoke about in terms of physical rehabilitation, plastic surgery, combined with psychosocial counseling and livelihood development. There is a whole array of activities that the trust fund itself, even if it could, it shouldn't engage in. So there, the need to have a partnership with a different type of donor who is able to connect with us on that particular program is already going to be welcome, because it does result in a situation where we are able to really, with the limited means that we have again, are able to focus our investments on those victims and those types of assistance which are really off the radar screen of the more traditional development partners.
Thank you. Why don't we open it up, and I think I saw Betsy with a question, and then Valerie.
Grace. Thank you. Betsy Andersen with the American Society of International Law. I have two questions, and they're kind of unrelated, but I'll throw them both out there while I've got the microphone. One is really picking up on this last point about taking advantage of the synergies between other development assistance and the work that you're doing. And it seems to me that that is a very good strategy for kind of leveraging what it is that you're doing. But I wonder how that ties back into the branding point that you made, and puts in, because I would imagine it would be difficult to brand somebody else's assistance, even if it's very closely coordinated with yours as trust fund assistance. And it makes me wonder, how important is the branding, and why is the branding important at all? If it seems to me in some ways it's even complicating of your mandate and work. And so that's one question. And second is on this whole issue of developing the reparations, principles and mechanisms, and you have several references in your report or in your presentation to a consultative process to figure this all out within the ICC and among the different institutions. And I'm wondering a little bit about that. And where is the transparency around that? And it seems to me in some ways that consultation should take place in the form of briefs and petitions and motions that are filed, and that victims and affected communities can respond to, and others can respond to. And so if you could explain to us a little bit about what is going to happen in open court and what is going to happen in that consultative process that may be more private within the institutions, and how does that work?
Sure. Should we take a few, maybe? Or?
Yeah, please. I think Valerie has one, and Edwin in the back, and then Valerie here.
This is a question for Kristin. It's kind of a specific question, but it stems from the work that I've been following at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, where there was a discussion between the defense, the prosecutor, and the judges about the specific harms faced by women and girls, especially girls who were forcibly married during the Sierra Leonean conflict versus those who were not, but were still subject to sexual and gender-based crimes. And the end conclusion, it seemed to me, from the judges was that those girls who had been forcibly married suffered from even more stigma than those who had suffered sexual violence but who had not been forcibly married. Is that borne out in your statistics?
Edwin Williamson, Sullivan Cromwell. A sort of not terribly different from Betsy's question, but I'm sort of sitting here and just wondering why is the court doing this work rather than on IO or an NGO? And is the court really qualified to do this? Does this work hinder and enhance the ICC's day job? Is it filling space? And is it filling the space, crowding out other organizations and other resources? And the question, I think just from a political standpoint in the United States, I think your ability to get government funds, development funds for this work would be 10 times greater without an ICC label on it than with. And then I was curious if other international tribunals have taken on an extensive addressing of the underlying social issues that lead to this in the first place, as I think you are bumping up against, and I think maybe you were proposing in your paper. And I'll just add a footnote about right after Ocampo was named prosecutor, I sat in on a meeting in New York where one of the things he proposed was, given that that the cause of this violence, particularly in the DRC, was the lack of employment, that what the ICC should really do is get out and establish industrialized zones. I thought.
Thank you. One last question right behind you. Yes, thank you.
My name is Susanne Rivelis, and I have been working in Africa on human rights for the last 15 years with grassroots organizations. And I have two observations. One very much to what this gentleman said, and that is in your really extremely interesting survey, I think in some of the answers from women, and the difference between women and men is reflecting the general attitude and esteem or low esteem for women in the society before the conflict and before rape and all of this breakthroughs in the DRC or in Uganda. So you are finding in their response that they want more individual or more community-oriented. Also the fear that if it doesn't go to them as a women in particular, they may not even benefit from it. So there are many underlying social aspects. That's one observation. The other is, I think, the importance for, when you were talking about working with the victims, the importance for the victim to be acknowledged as such, as having been one, or as having been tortured, or as having been going through this harm. It is very important for the victim, and that has to do with protection, that he or she, also the child soldier, can speak about it in the community, and that the community can acknowledge it in this way, helping towards reconciliation. So the last question is how much, and I remember Ocampo was talking about the importance of prevention. How much of your findings are going to inform the issues of protection and prevention for areas, as you say, in which conflict was and conflict continues, and there is post-conflict to be already foreseen that it is going to happen again or is happening while you are working?
Thank you. Maybe we'll start with those four. Take any others at the end.
On the question of branding, indeed, well, as you say, that's quite a complex challenge for the trust fund because the nature of our work and the nature of the partnerships that we have, they do impede to some extent our ability to brand the work that we are doing, and to brand the work that we're doing as being part and parcel of the Rome Statute system, if you wish, because that may come back and bite you in the tail. So we do need to be careful about it. We are being careful about that. On the other side, I don't think at the end of the day we're going to be able to hide the fact, and we should be highlighting indeed the fact that the trust fund and the work that we're doing is related, is part of a bigger picture, and does represent, I do believe, the uniqueness of the fact that this is an expression of the restorative justice dimension of the Rome Statute. I also believe, but I'm fairly recent, so perhaps Kristin, that as we progress and if we are getting more of a solid track record, I believe that the appreciation of the trust fund can be evolving with that as well. And I've encountered also during conversations I had in Uganda and DRC during my field visit, stories of partners who told me that the perception of the trust fund has evolved in a positive way as the results have been coming in, and with that also the fact the way that the ICC is being perceived. So given time, I think that particular aspect of the branding may evolve with that, and we may have more opportunities, but there will also always be a sensitive proposition in each and every new situation that we're going into. Having said that, I do believe that we can do more about branding outside of the situations in terms of attracting financial resources from sources which haven't been fully explored yet, and I do see there still a great opportunity to highlight the unique qualities of the Trust Fund for Victims. And I do think that in that particular respect, the Trust Fund has a reason of existence, as it has been written into the Rome Constitution, the Rome Statute after long debates, as having a rightful place representing restorative justice. The Trust Fund by itself is not an NGO, never will be an NGO. If there are similarities in the way that we are approaching communities, they are being limited again by the link that we have with the ICC. And I do believe that we are and we will be continue to be able to delimit where we should be intervening and where our partners should have, our international partners should have a wider engagement with the communities that we are working with. But I'm certain that's a debate that's never going to go away completely, whatever we say or whatever we do. In terms of the transparency of the consultations that we are having, yes, indeed, we do foresee to participate as the Trust Fund for Victims in a more official capacity once the proceedings come to that particular stage, and we do anticipate and hope that to be invited to come up with our with a filing and with our views as the other parts of the court will be. At this particular moment, none of the trials is at that stage yet, and what we're doing right now is, how shall I say it, is consultative in the way that we would like to avoid any misunderstandings, because these are things which never happened before. The different parts of the court need to find a way to dance with each other to avoid any accidents further down the road. There's nothing sinister going on right there at that moment. For us, it's important to be assured that for the Trust Fund will be part and parcel, not just at the receiving end of reparations, but also in the beginning, so that we will feel able and be able to implement any of the suggestions coming out of the decision of the court. But indeed, there will be, we do foresee to be a more formal and more transparent, indeed, implication of the Trust Fund in the proceedings.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for your questions. If I could just add, related to the gentleman who asked the question about our sort of added value and our work vis-a-vis the court itself. Again, I think there were people that were part of the discussions around the Rome Statute, but from what I understand, it came out of lessons learned from the other tribunals. And I can only tell you that, for example, the Yugoslavian tribunal is actually coming back to us now saying, it's really unfortunate we didn't have a trust fund for victims because now, as they're looking at their own legacy, they realize that victims really went unsupported and there were no potential court orders for reparations. So I think the trust fund in and of itself is quite unique, and that's why we want to measure this uniqueness, how we relate to the court and any potential convictions. But I don't think it would be appropriate for an international NGO to administer reparations on behalf of the ICC. So I think that role is quite unique in and of itself. And certainly the court orders for reparations are very specific related to the victims under that case. And so how could we be strategic in mobilizing our rehabilitation assistance to provide that in a way with the affected community around any potential court order for reparations. So again, I think this is very unique, and what we do is quite different from international NGOs and others. I wanted to mention, and thank you for your comments related to the social and cultural context. As an anthropologist, of course, I think what our findings are showing is that indeed what has happened prior to conflict is only exacerbated in terms of women's roles and how society and culture plays into that. And when you add conflict and this level of violence on top of it, they become even more marginalized when we're looking at rehabilitation and reparation programs. So I think we're in agreement, and the study is just highlighting that. And remember, we're part of a court, and oftentimes I have to say that we sit in meetings at courts with, in no disrespect, with lawyers who oftentimes aren't considering these issues when you're looking at reparations, for example, and discussing that. So this is part of our role, is to help bring that and help to inform the court through its own process to consider other sectors, and certainly society and culture are one. In terms of the prevention issues, I think the way the Office of the Prosecutor would talk about their role in prevention is obviously very different than ours. But what we do try to do through our program is incorporate reconciliation through our physical and psychological rehabilitation and material support. And reconciliation can happen in a variety of ways. We have large-scale reconciliation initiatives with affected communities in DRC. We have a project that is called Caravan de la Paix, which is the Peace Caravan. And this is managed by a grassroots NGO, and they go through communities, and thousands of people are able to come forward and talk about what has happened. And then they are able to at least express themselves and come together as a community to try to address some of the impact of the violence. And again, we see this as hopefully a form of prevention, but again, how that relates to reconciliation. We also look at that on an individual level. And this bridges to your question about what happens to women who have children born out of rape. And we have seen that actually we really need to reconcile that relationship between mother-to-child bond, and also between the mother and child and her own family, and again, that community. And so we see this as preventative, frankly, in terms of trying to address any future conflicts within that society. And so, yes, indeed, forced marriage has featured. It's spoken about differently in the context of DRC and Uganda, but it's similar finding in the case of Sierra Leone. And what we're seeing is when you have a child born out of sexual violence within that type of situation, those are the women and children that are the most stigmatized and discriminated against. And so, again, any potential court order for reparations, if they are not identified as victims, what does that mean if their perpetrators have been identified as victims under that court order, and you're not addressing the harm suffered by those women and children? And what does that mean for the society as a whole? I think that's, yeah.
So I think we have maybe time for one more question. We have about 3 or 4 minutes. Is there anybody else?
Yeah. I was wondering about how you work, if you do work with the United Nations Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture, because of course that does do similar work in terms of giving out grants for legal and reparations and rehabilitation work. And just looking at the financial sustainability, many of the countries, of course, that are biggest donors to the ICC Trust Fund are those that are big donors to the UN Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture. The big missing one, of course, is the United States, which is the largest donor to the UN Voluntary Fund. So I'm just wondering if you work with them, how that works, and how, you know, that in competition for funding, especially to international organisations, which, as this gentleman mentioned, is often not an area that countries necessarily want to give their funding to. You know, how you will work with them in that aspect, or if you work with them.
We've consulted with them. Actually, when we were starting up the trust fund, we did consult with other funds, such as the Victims Torture Fund, to get lessons learned from them and best practice in terms of starting this up, because this was unique and the court was already operating and the court itself didn't have systems in place for administering a fund in this way. But in terms of any potential conflict of interest, I mean, our support is very targeted to victims of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. And victims of torture, their fund is actually much more broad-based in terms of the support that they provide. We haven't found that there's been a conflict in terms, or that we are competing in any way in terms of resources related to that fund. And again, they wouldn't be administering reparations, a court-ordered reparations. So this would be very specific to this mandate. There might be some similarities related to the rehabilitation mandate, but frankly, where we're working, we haven't found that that fund is operating in the situations where the court has jurisdiction. And as Pieter mentioned, in northern Uganda, the victims who were mutilated received no support under any even donor assistance in terms of bilateral support or multilateral support from development assistance. And so we really target the support to victims that fall between the cracks of some of these other programs. And so hopefully this is where we're able to actually, I think, work together. I don't know if you wanted to say something. Yeah.
It's my understanding that this is the only fund that individuals can contribute to as well, the ICC Trust Fund.
Well, I'm not sure about the only fund, but it is a fund that, as an individual, you can contribute to.
Mm-hmm. Well, join me in thanking our excellent speakers today.